On the morning of April 19, 1995, Merrick Garland was on the fourth floor of the Justice Department building in Washington.
I was at my desk and I had a computer terminal, and it was typical in the morning. I was looking at reports from various U.S. attorneys' offices, other kinds of email that was coming in.
Of course, Merrick Garland is now the Attorney General of the United States. He's in his early 70s. But in 1995, he was 42 years old and the top aide to the Deputy Attorney General. I interviewed Garland at length for my book about the Oklahoma City bombing, but I wasn't given permission to record. This interview was recorded by the Oklahoma City National Museum and Memorial in 2013.
Urgent report came across the computer screen, and I clicked on it and opened it up. And there was a report saying that there had been an explosion at the Murrah building and that they would report more when they knew more.
Soon after that, Garland got another urgent report, then another, then another. Then he turned on CNN.
You can see debris and pieces of the construction hanging down the entire 6 stories. It's as if somebody came and sheared off an entire half of the building.
Garland was quickly assigned to lead the DOJ investigation and make sure that everything came together for an eventual trial. He asked Janet Reno, who was then the U.S. Attorney General, if he could go to Oklahoma. But leaving wasn't easy. Garland had 2 daughters, both under the age of 5.
It was a little scary for them. People didn't know whether this was the beginning of a range of bombings around the country or not. And our local police would drive by and stop and make sure everybody was okay. Turns out it was totally unnecessary. But there was just no way of knowing that at the time. And as you can see, I get emotional whenever I think about this. But
Garland has a reputation as a stoic man of the law. But even decades later, when he's asked about Oklahoma City, it's obvious that his role in prosecuting the bombing was deeply personal.
I wanted to go. It was a terrible scene on the television. And everybody who goes into public service wants to help.
Garland went home and packed immediately after his meeting with Reno. Then he drove to an airfield.
And as I'm getting on the plane, somebody brings me a cell phone. Now, in those days, a cell phone is not little, so it's like a heavy brick. By that point, they had identified McVeigh.
The investigation was moving very fast. It was only 2 days after the bombing.
And we stopped in Indianapolis to refuel, and somebody else came out with another brick and said, "Ms. Reno's on the phone." And she said, "We found him. He's at a jail in Oklahoma, and you're going to be doing the initial hearing tonight."
In Oklahoma City, the federal courthouse downtown had been damaged in the bombing. So McVeigh's initial arraignment took place at Tinker Air Force Base, a mammoth facility just inside the city limits.
So we're driving in, I think it was probably dusk, or maybe even a little bit later than dusk, and we see this huge crowd of people outside Tinker Air Force Base, and you never know what that's going to mean. It could be an angry mob. Turned out it was angry, but it wasn't a mob, it was the press corps, because they had not been allowed to go inside. It was an Air Force base, and it was ringed with barbed wire, and there were MPs with bayonets, and they weren't letting anybody in.
Garland went inside and found an FBI agent. He asked where the public was, where the press was. The agent said the Air Force had its rules. No press or public allowed inside the base.
I said, we don't want to do it that way. It can be bad enough there are going to be conspiracy theories. The defendant's going to complain he didn't get an open hearing. The law requires an open hearing. And they said, well, what do you want to do? I said, because there's several hundred people outside. I said, I don't know, draw names from my hat if you have to, but bring in as many as you can, and if there's any members of the public, bring some of them in too, so we can have an open hearing.
Garland wanted to prosecute McVeigh by the book and in full view of the public. He may have been emotionally moved by the horror of the bombing, but he was also meticulous and even-handed in running the investigation. Garland wanted to focus on what McVeigh did a lot more than he wanted to show why McVeigh did it. And he was not going to be distracted by anything beyond the crime itself. This was no easy task. After all, what does justice look like for the biggest act of domestic terrorism in modern U.S. history? I'm Jeffrey Toobin, and this is Homegrown. Episode 6, Clutter. Back in the late 90s, many journalists, including me, treated the Oklahoma City bombing like the isolated act of a crazed individual. Though we paid some attention to McVeigh's politics right after he was arrested, his beliefs came to be treated as an afterthought if they were mentioned at all. But of course, the bombing was a targeted political attack on the federal government.
You know, Moises Naim, you know him?
Say again?
Moises Naim.
In the course of revisiting Oklahoma City, what surprised me most was that the man then in charge of the federal government understood it right from the start.
So can we jump in on this? Why don't we start? Do you remember the day it happened, or
like it was yesterday.
tell me about April 19th, 1995.
Well, I was in the White House.
President Bill Clinton had a very different response to the Oklahoma City bombing than the narrow focus of Merrick Garland and his prosecution team. I sat down with the former president in May of 2022. We were in the Midtown Manhattan office of his foundation. This was an interview for my book, so I used my phone to record. Apologies for the quality, listeners. For Clinton, the bombing was personal from the beginning.
And they told me what had happened. A lot of kids had been killed in the daycare center, and that Secret Service man, Al Witcher, had been killed, who had been on my detail.
Secret Service agent Al Witcher had young children. He had left the danger of working a presidential detail to the apparent safety of Oklahoma City, where he could raise his family. Witcher was killed in the bombing.
And I was just heartbroken. But he became like a metaphor for all the other people that died from me. And I realized that, you know, for a moment I was just like everybody else. I was just a guy that knew somebody I cared about who died.
When a national tragedy happens, the role of the President of the United States comes into full focus. The country's head of state is meant to project control and calm, making space for processing grief in moments of national confusion. But the Oklahoma City bombing happened at a precarious moment in Clinton's presidency. In the midterm elections of November 1994, Republicans had won a historic victory. The GOP gained control of both the Senate and the House for the first time since 1952.
Now, as a historian, every time you've had an election that clear-cut, the word that has always been used to describe it is a mandate.
American politics was now dominated by the man who had orchestrated that revolution, the new Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich.
I mean, if this is not a mandate to move in a particular direction, I would like somebody to explain to me what a mandate would look like.
Clinton's power was diminished.
Gingrich saw himself as altering the constitutional balance. He thought that he could basically confine me to foreign policy, and that basically he was now in control of domestic policy.
On the evening of April 18th, 1995, just hours before the bombing, the president held a primetime news conference, which only one network chose to cover live. There, Clinton gave one of the worst sound bites of his presidency.
The president is relevant here, especially an activist president, and the fact that I am willing to work with the Republicans.
Clinton now says that what he meant by the president is relevant was that the Constitution gave his office relevancy. But to the press, it sounded like whining, a man trying to pretend like he still mattered. On the morning of April 19th, President Clinton was in the Oval Office for a photo opportunity with the Turkish Prime Minister. The chief of staff slipped Clinton a note that said, quote, "Half of federal building in OK City blown up. expect heavy casualties. Call Janet Reno, she has dispatched FBI. The visitor was ushered out, and the president moved his team to the Situation Room in the basement. Clinton spent much of the day trying to figure out what was going on.
And I was very worried that I knew I needed to make a statement that condemned the violence without assuming that it was an act of Islamic terrorism, which is what a
lot of people thought.
On television, and even in Clinton's own administration, there was a kind of knee-jerk assumption that Islamic radicals were behind the Oklahoma City bombing, just like the first World Trade Center attack, which happened only 2 years earlier. But Clinton, almost alone, thought differently.
And I just had an instinct that I said, this doesn't make sense.
In those initial hours, behind closed doors, Clinton told his staff that this seemed like something homegrown. He knew these people.
So, you guys got to understand, I told him, I said, I've been fighting this all my life.
I've been fighting this all my life. Before his presidency, Clinton had seen right-wing extremism up close. For 12 years, he was governor of Arkansas, which has long been the home of some of the movement's worst zealots. There was the case of Gordon Kahl, the notorious far-right tax protester. Kahl's life came to a violent end on Clinton's watch.
He murdered a sheriff in Lawrence County who was my campaign county coordinator.
There was the case of Richard Snell, a white supremacist who killed a pawn shop owner because he thought he was Jewish. Snell then killed a black Arkansas state trooper whose brother-in-law happened to work on Clinton's security detail as governor.
I took a keen interest in Snell's case, and he was a mean mother man.
Snell was sentenced to death in Arkansas, and the date for his execution happened to be April 19, 1995. There were some theories that McVeigh planned the bombing as a kind of protest on Snell's behalf. It turned out, though, that McVeigh had never even heard of Snell. Going back farther, Clinton's earliest political memory, when he was 11 years old, was of the Little Rock Nine, the 9 black students whose enrollment in Little Rock Central High School led to furious anti-integration protests.
He was followed in front of the school by an angry crowd, many of them shouting epithets at him.
Clinton never forgot the faces of his fellow white Southerners twisted with rage.
I saw what I had seen in Arkansas in the 50s and 60s. You know, how, if you could turn anything into politics and make it a us and them war, it was very powerful in the short run, but the consequences could be devastating. People that, if they feel their identity is in danger of being dislodged, then nothing else matters.
Memories of all that fury against the government, especially the federal government, remained with Clinton. On a gut level, he recognized the kind of anger that might lead someone to bomb a federal building.
The bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens. It was an act of cowardice, and it was evil.
In his initial public statement, Clinton expressed righteous fury against the perpetrators, whoever they might be. He promised that the government's response would be swift, certain, and severe.
The United States will not tolerate it, and I will not allow the people of this country to be intimidated by evil cowards.
The following Sunday, April 23rd, turned out to be one of the most consequential days of Clinton's presidency. A crowd of 18,000 had gathered at the Oklahoma City Fairgrounds for a memorial and prayer service.
I labored on the Oklahoma memorial speech. I felt like it was a real chance for us to be Americans again. And I just tried to make it real for everybody.
Muffled sobs filled the fairgrounds. Many of the victims' families held teddy bears, which became symbols for the children who died in the bombing.
This terrible sin took the lives of our American family, innocent children in that building only because their parents were trying to be good parents as well as good workers. Citizens in the building going about their daily business, and many there who served the rest of us. Let us say clearly, they served us well, and we are grateful.
Clinton's early hunch about who committed the bombing turned out to be correct.
One suspect, according to our sources, is in custody now.
McVeigh was in custody, and agents had found the right-wing screeds in his car.
And we can also give you a bit of a hint now as to where the government appears to be focusing its investigation on some of the what are called right-wing, white supremacist groups in various parts of the country.
And then there was Terry Nichols. He was arrested soon after agents found evidence that he had purchased bomb materials.
Dozens of heavily armed federal authorities raided a farmhouse just outside the small town of Decker. The property belongs to farmer James Nichols, brother of a suspect in the Oklahoma City attack.
Inside the Nichols family farm in Michigan, agents found more far-right literature.
Neighbors say Nichols' brother, Terry, belonged to a militant anti-government group. He surrendered in Kansas City earlier in the day.
The ideological motivation for the bombing was becoming clear. Now riding some of the highest approval numbers of his presidency, Clinton pressed his advantage.
We hear so many loud and angry voices in America today whose sole goal seems to be to try to keep some people as paranoid as possible and the rest of us all torn up and upset with each other.
This is a speech on Monday, April 24th in Minneapolis. In an unspoken but unmistakable way, the president tied responsibility for the bombing to the fervor of his political opponents, especially Rush Limbaugh. Clinton didn't yet know how right he was, that McVeigh was an avid Limbaugh fan.
They spread hate. They leave the impression that, by their very words, that violence is acceptable. I'm sure you are now seeing the reports of some things that are regularly said over the airwaves in America today. Well, people like that who want to share our freedoms must know that their bitter words can have consequences.
Looking back, it should have been obvious to me, to all of us, that Clinton's focus on the more extreme factions of the Republican Party was more than just a political move. It was an accurate assessment of the situation. The right-wing response to Clinton's speech and to the bombing established a pattern that has recurred for decades following acts of right-wing domestic terrorism.
This is a former president of the United States who 15 years ago tried to blame me for the Oklahoma City bombing, and in fact...
This is Rush Limbaugh in 2010, talking about Clinton's response to the bombing.
I said, Mr. President, give me the words that inspired McVeigh to blow up the building. Nobody can give me the words because McVeigh's own words were that it was a bunch of things culminated by Waco, not anybody's words.
Whether it was the Oklahoma City bombing, mass shootings, or the January 6th insurrection, Limbaugh, Gingrich, and their heirs have always responded in the same way. They make dutiful condemnations of the attacks themselves, followed by refusals to accept any responsibility for inspiring them. Speaker Gingrich made a ritual expression of sadness about Oklahoma City, but he persisted in demonizing the federal government. On Meet the Press, just 2 weeks after the bombing, he said,
"We have to understand that there is in rural America a genuine, particularly in the West, a genuine fear of the federal government and of Washington, D.C. as a place that doesn't understand their way of life and doesn't understand their values."
But the speaker's incessant demands to, quote, cut bureaucrats suddenly had a sinister edge because those individuals now had human faces of the victims inside the Murrah building. Before the bombing, when Clinton had complained about Limbaugh and Gingrich, the president sounded petty. But against the backdrop of Oklahoma City, his critique gained heft.
I mean, when I took office, there were like, 400 of these militia groups. The militia groups that really began to build up.
Yes, indeed.
And they were particularly prominent in Michigan. Everybody's forgotten, how big Michigan is and how rural it is.
This is a very free country. Those of you in the militia movements have broader rights here than you would in any other country in the entire world.
On May 5, 1995, Clinton gave a commencement speech at the graduation ceremony of Michigan State University. The state was chosen because the Michigan militia and native son Terry Nichols had clearly been implicated in the bombing.
So I say this to the militias and all others who believe that the greatest threat to freedom comes from the government instead of from those who would take away our freedom. If you say violence is an acceptable way to make change, you are wrong. If you say the government is in a conspiracy to take your freedom away, you are just plain wrong. If you appropriate our sacred symbols for paranoid purposes and compare yourselves to colonial militias who fought for the democracy you now rail against, you are wrong. I say to you, all of you, the members of the class of 1995, there is nothing patriotic about hating your country or pretending that you can love your country but despise your government.
There is nothing patriotic about pretending that you can love your country but despise your government. This became one of the most quoted lines of Clinton's presidency. It was a capstone for his rhetorical victory in the aftermath of the bombing. But in the way of the modern presidency, it kind of ended there. Other news cycles took over. After warning the country of the threat from the far right, Clinton turned over the matter of the Oklahoma City bombing to the Justice Department. The approach of the leaders there, chiefly a then-obscure Merrick Garland, would turn out to be very different from the president's.
It really looked like a war zone. You had to get through a ring of Humvees, which the National Guard, I guess, had set up maybe 10 square blocks or so around the bomb site as a crime scene.
Late at night, after McVeigh's initial hearing at Tinker Air Force Base, Merrick Garland made his way to the bomb site for the first time.
We drove through and you could see broken glass all over. You could see windows broken as you got closer and closer to the building, but still pretty far away from the building.
As Garland approached, he was blinded by massive spotlights lighting up the whole scene, making it look like it was the middle of the day.
First time you see the building and you see it not just on paper described and not just on CNN, but in front of you, just the enormity of what happened. It's just incredibly striking. And the most sad part, of course, is the first thing people pointed out was this is where the America's Kids Child Care Center had been. There was nothing there. It was just a big empty concave hole. So we just knew that anybody who had been there would have been just a miracle if they survived.
Merrick Garland was and is a quiet, cautious person who believes that lawyers should confine their speech-making to the courtroom. He understood that even in a case as seemingly cut and dried as this one, there were countless pitfalls that could result in embarrassing fumbles for the prosecution. In Garland's mind, one case loomed largest. For him, it was a flashing warning of what not to do.
The O.J. Simpson trial.
Go find the killers! O.J. is innocent!
You know, this was the most recent sort of trial of the century, which every few decades there's another trial of the century. We thought we would probably end up with another trial like that.
Garland became obsessed with the idea that something like the O.J. case was never going to happen on his watch. There would be no spectacles, no fame for the prosecutors, no joking about the lawyers and witnesses.
There were a lot of issues in that case about how the forensic evidence had been handled and also about how the people involved, the investigators, had handled themselves.
There was one joke in particular that repelled Garland. On Jay Leno's Tonight Show, 5 black-robed men who were made up to look like Judge Lancito came on stage as backup dancers for a woman dressed like prosecutor Marcia Clark. The O.J. trial made the American justice system look like a joke, and it served as a photo negative for how Garland wanted to proceed.
We knew that in the end we were going to have a trial, and I mean, my own experience had been several years after even very bad crimes, it looks different. And so you want to be sure that every I was dotted and every T was crossed.
The issue of law enforcement incompetence was in the air, and Garland knew that the public and prospective jurors would be watching the Oklahoma City case through that filter. It was tedious and perhaps unnecessary, but Garland set up shop processing search warrants for nearly every step the agents took.
Every time we went into Terry Nichols' car, which I insisted that we get a search warrant every time we searched the car, so that there would be no question that if we had missed something and if we went back in, that we were allowed to seize it. Same thing with his house. And we also wanted to be sure, again, this issue about conspiracy theories about maybe somebody else did it, or you hadn't done everything, or you hadn't found it. We wanted to be sure we had done everything we could possibly do to find every person who was involved.
One of Garland's first orders of business was to assemble a prosecution team that he could trust to make the trial as non-OJ as possible.
Of course, we wanted people with violent crime experience. We also wanted people who were low-key. We wanted prosecutors who would not be on the news, who would not talk to the press outside of the public appearances, who are not there to make a name for themselves.
In searching for someone to try the bombing case and lead the prosecution, one application stood out. Joseph Hartzler, here interviewed in an Oklahoma City National Memorial oral history.
The real goal was to restore faith in the jury system and in the system of justice in America. I think that was the overriding goal that I tried to maintain on a daily basis.
Hartzler came from the storied U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago. He investigated public corruption and some bombing cases, which were relatively rare in the federal system. When Garland checked out Hartzler with his contacts, he received glowing reports. Hartzler was said to have a, quote, affidavit face, a look of extreme trustworthiness. He was right in line with Garland's vision. This was not a guy looking to showboat in front of the press. When Hartzler took over the day-to-day operations, he found the amount of work to be overwhelming.
There was so much and so many witnesses, so many people that could testify as to particular individual events. It was pretty remarkable.
In response to the mountain of information coming in every day from federal agents, Hartzler created a Garland-esque mantra.
I had a sign on my wall, just a handwritten sign that said, don't lose the crime in the clutter, or something like that.
Do not bury the crime in clutter.
There was the don't bury the crime in the clutter. There was also the constant refrain, less is more.
Eitan Goldman was the junior member of the prosecution team. He was brought in to shadow Hartzler and pick up day-to-day assignments.
He was very focused on streamlining the case. And even if it was marginally helpful evidence, if it wasn't really probative, it would stay on the cutting room floor.
It meant, let's not overdo it. Let's make this simple.
Scott Mendeloff also came from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago.
One of the things that we all believed in was having a very tight case. And that's what Joe's sign was focused on. Let's have a tight case.
Garland had established a template that Hartzler would execute. The bombing case would be narrow and focused. It made sense from a law enforcement perspective if one believes, as Garland did, that the government's burden in a criminal case is limited to proving a specific defendant guilty of a specific crime. Garland's agenda in the aftermath of the bombing was very different from Bill Clinton's. The president sought to raise the alarm about the political and media culture that produced McVeigh. Clinton recognized the broader threat that McVeigh's worldview represented, and he tried to warn the American people about it. Garland saw his assignment very differently, and he was in a very different role. He wasn't about messaging to the public. He had a single case to try and to win, and as the president's attention turned to other subjects, Garland's view of the Oklahoma City bombing became the only one on display.
you become part of the scene. You just don't want to leave. You want to be sure that everything you've done works out all right and that everything is done right. So I certainly did not want to leave.
Garland was passionate about seeing the case through, but it turned out he was needed for a different crisis.
The bomber calls for a revolution against modern industrial society, saying the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. The
Unabomber had started acting out during this period, making threats, including a threat to blow up the Los Angeles airport.
Across almost 2 decades, the Unabomber had committed more than a dozen bombings, and the FBI had made no progress in catching him or even identifying who he was.
And so they wanted me to take over the criminal division. So I kept saying no, they kept saying yes.
Garland was called back to Washington to get his arms around that investigation, and he reluctantly agreed to leave the Oklahoma City case.
I wanted to be sure it was done right. Not that I didn't think anybody else could do it right, but by that time I'd had a lot of knowledge about early elements of the investigation, and you go into public service to serve, and this was the best chance I'd ever had. But in the end, I had to go back. I think they did the right thing making me come back.
Garland straddled 2 of the biggest investigations of the 90s. The Oklahoma City bombing and the Unabomber investigations unfolded simultaneously, with implications for how both are still perceived.
Federal agents have turned up a live bomb at the home of the man the government believes is the Unabomber.
Almost exactly a year after the bombing, in April 1996, Ted Kaczynski was arrested in a tiny cabin in Montana. From the start, Kaczynski was characterized correctly as a lone wolf. He lived an isolated existence deep in the woods. He was a genuine loner, a teenage math prodigy who turned into an anti-technology fanatic. Kaczynski followed no one, and he had no followers. Because McVeigh and Nichols were the only ones charged in the Oklahoma City bombing, that left the impression that McVeigh also represented no one except himself. But that wasn't true. McVeigh belonged to a thriving and enduring political movement in the United States. McVeigh himself recognized this distinction. After the Unabomber was arrested, Time magazine devoted an issue to both Kaczynski and to McVeigh. In a letter to his lawyer Stephen Jones, McVeigh wrote,
"Time, unfortunately, has failed to recognize the stark difference between the Unabomber and the Oklahoma City bombing. Namely, the Unabomber has approximately 1 sympathizer, whereas the Oklahoma City bombing represents a massive feeling of disenchantment and growing unrest in the country."
Thanks to the way Garland organized the prosecution and the way criminal trials generally work, the idea took hold that the bombing was just about Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols. In limiting their mission that way, Garland and his subordinates actively discouraged the idea that the 2 men represented something broader than their own criminal behavior, and the case against McVeigh looked very strong. But still looming in the background was something that could have derailed the whole thing: the idea of a broader conspiracy. And for all their meticulous work, Garland's team unintentionally emboldened the conspiracy theories with a critical mistake. It all came down to a single sentence. From the start, the government's case against Timothy McVeigh seemed rock solid.
I described to one of my friends about this case before we went to trial. The evidence against this guy is really just overwhelming.
Lead prosecutor Joseph Hartzler.
It's like a slam dunk from a stepladder. He said to me, "Yeah, but those are the slam dunks you don't want to miss." Well, okay. I guess that's the challenge, not to miss a slam dunk from a stepladder.
They had McVeigh renting the Ryder truck at Elliott's Body Shop and then spending the night at the Dreamland Motel. They had Charlie Hanger's arrest of McVeigh at a time and place that showed he could have left the Murrah building when the bomb went off. They even had bomb residue on McVeigh's shirt. and they had the right-wing literature in his car that provided a motive. But there was one major loose end that the prosecution was very worried about. Prosecutor Scott Mendeloff.
So we knew that if we didn't address this, that was going to create a big sideshow in the trial because it would suggest we didn't know what we were doing.
John Doe number 2.
I remind everyone that John Doe number 2 remains at large. He should be considered armed and extremely dangerous. There is a strong...
This became a cause célèbre around certain elements in the country, especially right-wing elements, to suggest that we didn't have the right people and that there was a broader conspiracy. And we knew that we had to deal with this.
If you remember from the previous episode, the way that the FBI identified McVeigh was in part through some sketches. The main eyewitness to McVeigh's rental of the Ryder truck was a mechanic named Tom Kessinger. Kessinger described 2 men who had picked up the truck. The first clearly matched McVeigh, crew-cut, army-looking guy. The second, John Doe number 2, was a white man with a beefy build, dark brown hair, and brown eyes. Kessinger also remembered part of an arm tattoo and an odd-looking baseball cap. Considering such a detailed description, John Doe number 2 hardly seemed like a figment of Kessinger's imagination. So who was that guy? This was the FBI's lead agent, Weldon Kennedy.
I would like to emphasize that we are still attempting to identify and locate the man known as John Doe number 2. The only description we have is the composite sketch, which has been widely publicized.
The public release of the sketches generated literally thousands of tips. John Doe number 2 was seen in Kansas, Arizona, New York, and several other states as well. None of these leads were credible, so the FBI tried a different approach.
They went back to review and interview and photograph and develop evidence of every single person that rented trucks at Eldon Elliott's body shop. And sure enough, 2 of the people that rented a truck very similar to the type that McVeigh rented were 2 servicemen from Fort Riley who had rented the truck the day after McVeigh rented his truck at about the same time of the day that McVeigh rented his truck.
The 2 men were named Michael Hertig and Todd Bunting. Hertig had a crew cut, and he bore a rough resemblance to both McVeigh and the sketch of John Doe number 1.
Bunting looked exactly like John Doe 2. And it became obvious to us that what ended up happening was that these people had conflated the 2 events and remembered similar trucks being rented by similar looking people, but put McVeigh in with Bunting.
Bunting looked so much like the sketch of John Doe number 2 that he even had a tattoo of a Playboy bunny on his arm, and he was wearing a Carolina Panthers cap with white wings on the sides, just like Kessinger had described. So the FBI interviewed Kessinger again.
What we had to do is very carefully take Kessinger through this because we did not want to be suggesting an answer to him. Let's go back, Tom, to exactly what you remember from that day and what you said on that day. And then we showed him these various things.
They showed Kessinger a picture of Bunting's tattoo.
Does this look like the tattoo? That's exactly what it looked like. That's it.
Then they showed Kessinger a picture of Bunting's hat.
Does that look like that hat that you sketched? He says, I gotta admit, it does. And we said, what would you say if the guy with the tattoo and the guy who's wearing this hat is the same guy? And his eyes sort of got big. And then we showed him the picture and we said, Tom, does that look like the guy you were thinking of? That's him. So that changed everything.
To the FBI and the prosecutors, this sealed it. There never was a John Doe number 2. And with Kessinger's testimony, they could prove that to a jury. Then there were the charges. Just 2 days after the bombing, when McVeigh was taken into federal custody, he was charged in a simple complaint. Garland prepared that document quickly, having only arrived in Oklahoma City that same night. It was a bare-bones set of allegations. But in order to bring McVeigh and Nichols to trial, the prosecutors had to prepare a document setting out the government's charges in full. That's called a grand jury indictment.
I would say part of the experience was humbling, because when you make mistakes in a notorious case, they become, so public.
Lead prosecutor Joseph Hartzler.
I would say the biggest mistake I made was the indictment.
Prosecutors worked hard on the indictment. It was a powerful, detailed summary of facts. Setting out the timeline, the indictment described the bombing conspiracy as starting on September 13, 1994, the day that President Clinton signed the assault weapons ban. It laid out the purchases of fertilizer and the rentals of the storage sheds and all the fake names that McVeigh and Nichols used. It talked about the quarry robbery and Nichols' letter to McVeigh, which urged him to, quote, go for it. It also provided a powerful reminder of the magnitude of the crime. 5 of its 15 pages were devoted simply to listing the names of the people who were killed. But the indictment left one big open question: whether anyone besides McVeigh and Nichols were involved.
You can imagine in August of 1995 that there was no measure of confidence that the only 2 people who were responsible for bringing down that building and killing so many people could be, 2 men in a truck.
In August 1995, the investigation was still very much ongoing. Larry Mackey was the second in command on the prosecution team.
There were obviously a lot of allegations that there were others, and we were all about the process of trying to run each and every one of those questions down to ground. But at that moment in time, when the speedy trial clock had ticked and it was time to bring those formal charges, no one could say with absolute certainty that the only 2 people could be McVeigh and Nichols.
In the indictment, the first count charged McVeigh and Nichols with conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction. And here you have to pay attention to the legalese. Specifically, it said, the 2 men, quote, knowingly, intentionally, willfully, and maliciously conspired, combined, and agreed together, and with others unknown, to use a weapon of mass destruction. Lead prosecutor Joseph Hartzler.
In conspiracy cases, we would use boilerplate language about so-and-so and so-and-so conspired with others unknown to do such and such. And we do that in drug conspiracies so commonly.
Before the indictment was released, it was reviewed by probably a dozen Justice Department lawyers, all of them experienced prosecutors, including Garland himself. Nobody noticed or commented on those 3 words, with others unknown. They read right through them.
And I'm pretty sure I'm probably the one that drafted it, which is a mistake.
And it also became, obviously, fuel for the fire of every conspiracy nut who wants to say that I don't care whether we're now 25 years after the bombing, there still must have been somebody else involved.
Throwing others unknown, we didn't need it. It was just not a good, it was a mistake.
The filing of the indictment on August 11, 1995 marked a major milestone in the investigation, and the initial public reaction was good. The consensus was that the case looked strong, but McVeigh's defense team would have a different reaction.
I knew then we had a defense.
McVeigh's lead defense attorney, Stephen Jones.
And it's like you took, Jeff, 3 tabletop puzzles and took a third from each puzzle and then put it on the table and tried to make one puzzle out of it. The pieces did not fit. And the defense was, hey, the government's got problems proving this.
For the defense, with others unknown, provided an opportunity. If there were others, why was the government just prosecuting McVeigh and Nichols? Were they just patsies for the real masterminds? Those were good questions to present to a jury to poke holes in the government's case. For Jones, this was a chance to block Hartzler's slam dunk from a stepladder. Unfortunately for Jones, though, the prosecution had company in insisting that the 2 men had acted alone. His client said the same thing.
My concern with Tim was that Tim, as I perceived it, Tim wanted to take credit.
Next time on Homegrown, the defense of Timothy McVeigh.
He thought he was in charge, chairman of the board, is the way I put it. And I said, well, you are, in terms of whether you plead guilty or not, whether you testify or not, and I will always consult with you. But you're not the chairman of the board, you're the client.
Homegrown Oklahoma City is a USG audio podcast produced by Western Sound in association with Esmail Corp. It's reported, written, and hosted by me, Jeffrey Toobin. Executive producers are Josh Block at USG Audio, Sam Esmail and Chad Hamilton at Esmail Corp., and Western Sound's Ben Adair and Colin McNulty, who is also the editor. Production support from Josh Laulongi at USG Audio. The producer and sound designer is Tyler Hill. The associate producer is Stella Hartman. The producer from Esmail Corp. is Sarah Maddy. Original theme and engineering by Alex McGinnis. Fact-checking by Nicole McNulty and Savannah Wright. Special thanks to Betsy Shepard and Dan Leone. Passages of Timothy McVeigh are read by Chris Cowan. Our gratitude also to the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum and the Briscoe Center at the University of Texas. For more information on this podcast and other podcasts by USG Audio, go to our website, usgaudio.com. And to learn even more, read my book, Homegrown, Timothy McVeigh and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremism.